All right, so this is chapter 3 of Learning and Cognition, and we'll be going over the cognitive architecture. As we begin to look at the cognitive architecture, we have to be able to acknowledge once again that behaviorism played a huge focal point in the development or the lack thereof when we talk about cognition. When we look beyond one's actions, pretty much. Other theorists began to contemplate a need for more of a thought process to go into how we see the psyche, and ultimately began to feel about ourselves in terms of the environment's impact and influences on our psyche. So, as we move toward seeing the complexities of the human mind, we also began to look at the parallels of our minds to that of a computer. So, in terms of talking about the computer metaphor, we're looking at those parallels of the mind being similar to computers, and this actually started back in the 50s. As computers came into existence, this gave psychologists the metaphor to be able to explain how our minds function. The metaphor helped psychologists to look at different processes of the brain and how it engages in things such as attention and perception, which could be compared to inputting information into a computer, and then looking at memory, which could be compared to the computer's storage space. This was referred to as the information processing approach and is still fundamental to cognitive psychology today. Information processing is especially interested in how people would select, store, and retrieve one's memories. Back in 1956, George A. Miller, a psychologist, he developed the theory, and he also contributed to the idea that one can only hold a limited number of pieces of information in terms of our short-term memory. Miller specified that this number as 7, give or take 2, which can actually be 5 or 9 chunks of information. But more recently, there's been other scholars that would have suggested that the number can be even smaller than that. But unlike the computer, our minds can do even more. The brain demonstrates our ability to be able to strive toward a purpose, possess a value system, regulate our emotions, as well as contribute to our personality and our level of awareness, which streams through our consciousness. Technology has made huge attempts to be able to create a consciousness through what we know as artificial intelligence. But ultimately, at this time, our mind remains superior. How long? Not sure. But that's how that would go. So while the information processing theory use of a computer as a metaphor for our minds, it's been proven to be essential but also limiting. Computers aren't really influenced by things like emotions or motivations, unless you consider the person providing the data, within the ability to learn and remember information. But these things can have a powerful impact on people itself. In addition, while computers tend to process things sequentially, evidence shows humans are capable of parallel processing. With that said, let's discuss the sensory register. When we discuss the sensory register, we're speaking about our memories. It's the memories that last for merely a second or even less. The sensory register is important because it's the initial task as information reaches our sensory organs like the eyes, our ears, our fingertips, and so forth. In terms of processing, we gain insight into our real-life experiences through the sensory register. Our visual sensory register, or iconic memory, this lasts approximately for half a second. And we know that most of our visual information really doesn't immediately disappear as we repeatedly are looking and viewing at different images. Additionally, when we're looking at something, we process all the visual images together at one time. Now, in terms of our auditory sensory register, or echoic memory, now this lasts slightly longer, which is helpful because the sound waves are more time sensitive than it would be in our visual images. We can't review sound waves unless the actual sound is repeated. Also, sound is kind of processed through separate bits of information, and each bit gives meaning to the previous bit, which then gives us meaning for the sound. As a result, the brain has to have more time to be able to store that audio information. Information that makes it through the sensory register has one of four types of features. One, it may be forgotten almost immediately, as we do with much of the information that we really do not regard as important at that time. Iconic memory, again, lasts for less than a second, while echoic memory lasts for about 4 seconds. The second thing is, it may be held briefly, up to about 20 seconds approximately, through those simple attention and repetition, as we would do with the numbers. Like if we were trying to call Papa John's and we looked it up on our, I have an iPhone, whatever smartphone you might use, you might pull up that information and try to recall it instead of just pressing that little link to automatically call. Well, I tend to try to remember the numbers, but it's often going to be referred to within our short-term memory. The third thing is, it may be held a little longer. That could be for a few minutes through the frequent repetition or simple chunking of the information, putting it into smaller items, as we might do with that phone number, or if we try to remember the name of a person at a dance or a party. So now, we often call this our working memory. Working memory also comes into play when we try to recall previously learned information from our long-term memory. The fourth thing would be what we call elaborative rehearsal, that being association, reorganization, repetition, as well as testing oneself. This becomes part of our long-term memory process. So I wanted to kind of demonstrate what sensory learning is all about. And I was looking at, like I said, technology has made huge leaps and bounds. And because of that, we have what, Steve Jobs had been able to create within Apple. That started with Apple, his expand. I have an iPad Pro, and one thing I did was I downloaded something that is actually for preschoolers. It's created by teachers, in which they're utilizing sensory registry. So I wanted to give a little example. This is from Kidopius, and this is on phonics. Now, they don't only do just phonics. They do numbers, math. They're starting to help children to spell and so forth. So this is just a little example of what it might look like. What I want you to think about is, which learning processes do it represent?
Choose the letter which makes this sound. K. Fantastic. Awesome. N. Great work. R. Correct answer. Qu. K. This is not correct. Qu. Wonderful. J. You are brilliant. Oh. Keep it up. L. Very good. P. Congratulations. K. Good job. J. Well done.
All right, so anyway, as you get to see my little fun screen, when we see that they've used sensory register, you need to think about what types that they use. Here we heard sounds and we also seen visual. Would this be a cognitive process, or did it also involve some behavioral aspects? Think about it, and I'll probably throw up a quick question in the discussions that you can make an answer to that. So let's move forward. All right, so we talked briefly about working memory and short-term memory, and you know that this is something that's been used interchangeably, and pretty much this is a special component to our processing consciousness because it helps us in being aware of the here and now. Short-term memory is really important within our cognitive processing, as it either helps or hinders our ability to be able to problem solve. Our short-term memory will allow us to be able to focus our attention. It helps us to resist distractions, or it allows us to narrow our search when we're thinking in terms of a problem space. But on the other hand, there has been evidence that showed that too much focus can actually harm performance on a creative or insightful problem-solving type of task. So it's really important not to be able to get overwhelmed um, or to overwhelm your short-term memory by flooding with information when you're attempting to move it into long-term memory. When we look at the text, Martinez, I don't know why I go crazy with his name lately. It's Martinez. But he discusses how that limited capacity of working memory kind of implicates that our mind must be able to structure the information that it takes in. That structural principle proposes that we recognize the capability of the capacity that is the parameter of that 7 plus or minus 2, and that theory lends itself to say that we can take smaller amounts better than we would larger amounts. Thus, we rather hear of a smaller task rather than an extremely larger one. Think about it. If I was to say to you that I want you to read 5 chapters within the next week compared to reading just the next chapter, you would kind of feel a little overwhelmed and saying, wow, Dr. Kearns-Cooper, really? Do you really think that I'm going to be able to get all that information if I do all 5 chapters compared to just reading one? So, you know, he conveyed that not only is our working memory going to be synonymous with the short-term memory, but it takes in all of our experiences. There's an additional feature that's attached, and that's being the role of being able to do the work on information itself. Both in terms, again, is going to be interchangeable, but the term working memory really implies something slightly different. That being, it gives a little bit more than just a short-term memory. Working memory is about taking short-term information uh, and storing it within our mental framework. These two functions tells us that working memory is that real-time workspace of our minds. Being able to cooperate within the design of the mind is simply saying that we take in or ingest the new information that we need to be able to allow the brain to gather it, to decipher it, in a matter that's going to be that will be capable of. Think of those times though that you did get overstimulated. Imagining yourself having all of the if you were teaching or being a teacher's assistant and you were teaching a course and your students bombard you with a whole bunch of questions at one time. It can kind of be difficult to be able to hear at least one question, to be able to recall that question as well as to be able to answer the question appropriately. Those are what we're saying is taking things in. So you would probably get your students to settle down and say one question at a time so that you allow your brain to take it in, absorb the question that was asked, and to be able to retrieve the information needed to be able to answer it successfully. All right, so let's talk about long-term memory. Our minds, it has the ability to store a great deal of information, and you've been able to place within your internal file cabinet everything that you have ever experienced since you first started going to school up until now. At a moment's notice, you can be able to retrieve this information that's been placed in your long-term memory. Long-term memory is that final stage of the multi-store memory model that was first proposed by Atkinson and Schifrin, and it's providing you with that ability of lasting retention of information and skills. The capacity of our long-term memory, it can be unlimited. That main constraint on recall being accessibility rather than availability. The duration ranges from merely a few minutes, or it can be actually a whole lifetime. And we mainly will encode things that are semantic and visual, but it can also be auditory. There are several different types of information that's encoded as well as organized within the long-term memory. We use declarative information, which is that information that can be discussed, like facts and concepts and ideas. That falls under semantics. And then there's our personal experiences, which falls under episodic memory. The procedural memory is going to be that information that we know how to do something, like be able to drive a car or brush your teeth. And it's a lot to deal with in terms of imagery, which are those mental pictures involved. Pavio in '96 proposed that we have what we call a dual coding theory. And this theory recognizes language as well as mental imagery as two dominant forms of our knowledge base, which we use in the mind. It gives equal weight to verbal as well as nonverbal type of processing. He stated human cognition is unique in that it becomes specialized for dealing simultaneously with language and nonverbal objects and events. And moreover, that language system is peculiar in that it deals directly with linguistic input and output, which are the forms of speech or writing, while at the same time serving a symbolic function, which would be respect to our nonverbal objects, effects, as well as behaviors, events, as well as behaviors. Any representational type of theory would accommodate this dual functionality. Finally, when we look at other representational models, we look at the fact that our ability to use our long-term memory comes from using not just our ability to visualize, but our ability to use our smells, our tastes, what we touch, what we can hear. Our senses combined is a major contributor to our episodic as well as semantic memories. So let's summarize all that fun stuff. We're going to give you a summary of the cognitive structure. In terms of our long-term memory, there's thinking, learning, memory, goals, as well as beliefs. It's an information processing model because it looks to be artificial information processing devices, specifically that metaphor of computers, and how the human mind is structured as well as how it functions. We've been able to see how, for example, that one similarity between the computers and our minds is that we both store memories. we're able to identify the three memory structures that's in the human cognitive system, that being sensory register, that also being our working memory or short-term memory, and then the long-term memory. And these three memory systems are the foundation of our cognitive system. So looking at some basic cognitive processes, we know that cognitive processes has different assets of information that will travel through the cognitive system. Our first to discuss would be sensation, and that's that brief recording of environmental stimuli that's going into the sensory register. We then look at perception, and that's the cognitive act of being able to impose order on sensory data as it enters into our working memory. Now, the Gestalt theory, utilizing figure and ground, allows us to simplify those visual scenes as we take them in. When we look at the phi phenomenon, now this is allowing us to be able to use an illusion in order for us to be able to distinguish as well as perceive movement in stationary objects. Our brain and our visual organs allows us to perceive continuous movement from a series of images. Illusion of smooth movement is created when our brain fills in those missing pieces of information that doesn't exist between successive images. In terms of constructivism, this is that approach in learning that holds that people will actively construct or be able to make their own knowledge, and that reality is going to be determined by the experiences of that specific learner. Top down and bottom up. Now with top down, we're using our background knowledge from previous experiences to be able to influence our perceptions. This is considered a driven type of theory. Whereas when we're talking about bottom up processing, this allows for a stimulus to kind of influence our perceptions. So if you don't know anything about something, then that stimulus, particular stimulus that's going to be in your view will actually dictate what you believe it to be. You're starting with nothing in terms of what's perceived, and then you'll construct a thought of what it might be based on because of the stimulus that you're looking at. Bottom-up processing is considered data-driven, and your perception of that stimulus will direct your cognitive awareness of it. In terms of attention, this is where we're holding information in our conscious awareness of working memory. The cocktail party phenomenon. Now that's when you might be out. You've heard of it. You're out. You're hanging out in a large crowd, and there's a whole bunch of talking and everything going on. But you're able to attain your attention directly to the person that's before you. Okay, you're able to give focus, even though you're surrounded by many. Our brain's ability to filter through those several voices, for example, to be able to pay attention to one person that's speaking to you. Multitasking, okay, that's when you're doing two or more things simultaneously in which you switch back and forth from one task to another and performing these tasks in a rapid succession. Now, research has demonstrated, though, that switching from one task to the next task can take a serious toll on our productivity. Multitaskers have more trouble tuning out distractions than people who focus on one thing at a time. Also to consider, there's many different things at once that can actually impair our cognitive ability. Here's an example. Let's take driving and texting. Many people feel that they can handle texting while they're driving, but evidence has demonstrated over and over again how many people that have done this was actually in an accident because of it. So learning is that moving information that's from temporary working memory to an enduring long-term memory. And I kind of like how Martinez sees learning as a recording of it, a recorder of information to the long-term memory. When I was in graduate school, and even still to this day, when I went to put content that I learned into my long-term memory, I would get out an old-fashioned paper and pen and write everything out that I wanted to be able to remember. Now, this allowed the working memory to move it into long-term memory storage. This is what we call an example of write time parameters. Now, the key word here is time. Martinez, he talked about the metaphor of random access memory, or RAM, being parallel to our working memory. RAM receives new information and it temporarily will store that information in files such as, the time, you would need it, and would put it into our hard drive. Now, unlike the computer, our write time might take considerable more amounts of time to be able to move that information into the long-term memory. Think of it like this. One piece of information, like a word, would take approximately 1 minute for us to be able to store that into long-term memory. So imagine the amount of time it would take to store a theory. Or if you wanted to try to lock this chapter that you're reading into your long-term memory, you would be storing on average at least 5,000 words. So basically, this is meaning that you'll need to commit almost 84 hours to be able to place this into your long-term memory. Wow. So how are we able to do that? We often utilize rehearsal, which that's going to be considered the basic strategy to be able to remember things. And before the age of technology in which we live now, with devices that holds almost infinite amounts of information for us, to be able to remember a phone number, or let's say your social security number, which I'm hoping you do know that by heart, we had to repeat it to ourselves over and over again until we no longer needed the visual aid to be able to recall it. This leads us into talking about depth of processing. And this is a more complex way to being able to take information and move it from this working memory into long-term memory. Here we're combining new information with information that we already know. It's allowing the connection between the two to solidify that learning opportunity for us. So speaking of my study habits, when I discussed how I would write down what I wanted to remember, I didn't mention that once I wrote everything out, that I would then read it aloud repetitiously. I would then, after that, put what I wrote into my own words, my language, changing that information to a binary code, if you will. But not only did I rehearse the information, I combined it with my favorite music and songs. I would listen to a particular song over and over again as I would read this information aloud and change this into my own language. And yes, I know this is multitasking, but in this instance, I was actually able to concentrate more on that new material while allowing my semantic memories to fuse with those procedural memories. So when it came time for me to be able to retrieve this information during the exam, if I came across any kind of material that wasn't really coming back easy to my mind, I would think about my favorite song and begin to hum it. And as I sang under my breath those words to the song, I would begin to develop a mental picture of the new information once the image came into my mind. Now this allowed me to be able to retrieve that new information. This is what meaningful learning is all about. So there are two types of rehearsals that we may use. The first is what is called a type 1 elaboration. My reading aloud the information over and over again is an example of that. But using this method only gives me the structure of the words, but there is no real meaning behind the words. That other type of rehearsal, the type 2 elaboration, is creating something new with taking the new information and combining it with prior information to be able to use it. So in more than just reciting it. So as I rehearsed and take that information and put it into my own language, allowing myself to say it in my own words, I'm now able to use and see this with a meaning behind it. It's allowing me to be able to use it for analytical thinking because now I know more than just what the words are. I know the meaning behind them. My associations with prior knowledge takes on a new dimension in that I can now use this theory and apply it to the work that I'm doing, such as explaining the theory to you and being able to demonstrate ways of using it. This is ultimately now known as the generation effect. Taking information at face value is a form of superficial learning, and I can memorize the alphabet, but if I do not understand how to use the alphabet to create the words that will allow me to communicate in a meaningful way, then what I have is a superficial and it's really not going to be that useful to me. So, in terms of remembering, we know that remembering is moving information from long-term memory back into our working memory. Knowing is allowing us to take that knowledge from the long-term memory, and that feedback loop pretty much shows that our knowledge base in long-term memory is going to affect all of our cognitive processing. What we know guides and constrains how we think at every step of the way. And then retrieval is being able to access the information that we have in long-term memory. We're taking, when we're retrieving, think of our minds as a big giant file cabinet, and we're able to go through it. And sometimes it's not going to be that easy to do that. Our ability to recall is just gathering and pulling up that information, but the strong part is actually the recognition of it and knowing what to do. We take cues from some of that information that's within us now in our prior knowledge, something visual that's going to be able to help us to recognize that I need to be thinking about something other, and it helps me to retrieve the information and remember. Now, when we speak of the funnel of information, we're looking at how the mind filters the information into patterns that we can easily move toward long-term memory. To narrow the field of information that's being taken in, there's 4 cognitive processes that we utilize. First one being sensation, and as we talked about earlier, here it's a great amount of information that we take in. We'll see many things, we'll hear a great deal, as well as feel a lot. And what happens is our brains contend with the data through the sensorium of all our senses combined. And that sensorium registers will help to make available enormous amounts of information. This information is going to be held very briefly within that first stage of the cognitive system, the sensory register. The second one being perception. This is where our mind works quickly to perceive faces, perceives other type of objects like plants or people or books. And these simple acts of patterns will detect information that's going to be more simpler than the huge amount, enormous amount that would really strike our senses. So even as we take in information from these raw sensations, that momentary perception of our patterns is going to be considerably reduced through data reduction. The third one is attention. Here, it's a more enduring engagement within our working memory. But again, we have a data reduction occurring. It's going to be filtered. And it's that transition from the sensation to perception that'll move toward attention, which entails this huge amount or a significant amount of data reduction. So when we talk about the next one, which is learning, we know that behavioralists defines learning as a relatively permanent change in our behavior as a result of our experiences. But in terms of the cognitive process, learning is that moving of information from our working memory into long-term memory. But just as there is data reductions within sensation and perception, so too is there data reductions during the learning process. Our brain will retain what it feels is going to be the most relevant, and then it's going to let the rest of it go. And that's going to be during the transition from working memory to long-term memory. Let me ask you this. How many of you utilizes a daily planner or take notes in your notebook, use a calendar, or like me, I love sticky notes? Before technology came along and there was an app, which I do have that app for sticky notes. I used to keep post-its and post notes everywhere to help me to remember things that I had to do. Now I do have that app, and trust me, I keep to-do notes all day long and other information that I think is relevant on this app, like my passwords. But my passwords are encrypted for only me to read, so I don't feel bad about putting it there. Uh, but because our mind is continuously working on things, there are times when cognitively we can use that little assist or help. So our mind will focus on the big picture, basically. Using notes keeps the minor things at our reach. This is what's referred to as that external memory. When we look at working memory, we have to understand that it's limiting in the sense of how much information is filtered. The information slows pretty much as it's going to be narrowed in the process of taking things in. Our mind compensates this progression by using what Miller coined as chunking. A chunk is that pattern of meaningful information and is seen in the terms of units that's loaded onto the working memory. So chunking is that grouping of several units. Remember, Miller says it's at least 7, give or take 2, of units being put together. Chunking is quite helpful, not just for number patterns, but it's for other type of configurations. Martinez I did it again. Uh, he talks about how chess players utilize chunking in terms of being able to strategize how they'll approach the game. When we study, we often use chunking of the material to take that information from working memory into our long-term memory. Think about the acronyms that we create to help us study or to ease our minds. Instead of trying to say like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they say FBI. Or instead of saying an examination for a professional psychologist preparation, and I'm not even sure I said it correct, but EPPP. So our declarative knowledge is going to be that information that will be factual that we usually will chunk so that we can take that in and be able to retrieve it much easier. In terms of automaticity, I'm having fun with my pronunciations today, but our minds utilize procedural knowledge, and that's, of course, knowing how to do things without second thought. And the more you do something, the easier it'll become until you really don't have to think about it when you're doing it. Like being able to ride a bike, or in the example that you see on the slide, driving a car. Automaticity will apply to various facets, like our ability to read, our ability to write, to do math and calculations. It allows us to perform more complex tasks easier without overriding the brain. So throughout this lecture, I was able to go over the 3 memory structures and how it works in basic cognitive processing. This all will fall within the laws of learning. Looking at the design of the mind in terms of how it operates, we see how the serial position curve, which is that sequential representation of what we have learned. The textbook provides a figure that demonstrates this, and that figure is 3.6. That'll demonstrate the pattern of a U-curve. As the curve bends, here is where the information will be at its weakest, in which you might not be able to immediately recall that information. So basically, you're more apt to remember what you first started with and what you may finish with than what was found in the middle. This is what we call primacy and recency effects. And with the primacy effect, of course, that's that information that's first presented. And the recency is usually going to be the last thing that you hear that will be more or less locked within long-term memory. The serial position curve essentially is about how we learn in one session. When learning, we must be careful about interference. Martinez uses the example of a lecture, and I will use his example. So when you first started listening rather, to this video lecture, you prepared yourself by making yourself comfortable. Perhaps you got your favorite beverage, had something to eat put by you, and then you sat down with a clear mind. Now, however, we've reached beyond the midpoint of this lecture, in which your enthusiasm is probably starting to wane. My voice is not as clear to you anymore. It's not upbeat enough for you. I might be lulling you to sleep. Hope I'm not. But you'll begin to think about other things you have to do, which is now interfering with the information that I'm trying to provide you. So as you near the end of this video, you're more likely to be back to a point where you're going to be more focused because you know you're approaching the end. And because you're approaching the end, you start to pay more attention again. This is how the serial point curve works. So as an instructor, my goal is to let you know what it is that I'm going to discuss. Start putting it in your mind at first. And then I'll start presenting this information, hopefully not losing you at the midpoint. But then I'm going to come back and I'm going to recap some of this information, which I have been doing, so that you actually do not lose too much of the information that I gave you at the midpoint of this lecture. Okay, so now that I've guided you back and got your attention again, let's look at how we encode specificity. This is that second general principle within regards to learning. Here, what we're doing is we're using physical context, meaning that that's that learned encoded material, and we're linking it to what's specific, depending on what that stimulus might be, to the context that's going to be learned. Martinez provides the scuba experiment as an example, and I'm not going to go over that experiment. Pretty much I'll ask you to go ahead and read it, and you'll find it on page 70. In terms of the emotional context, now this is where we're looking at how our emotional state will influence what we learn. How you feel at the moment of learning something will actually determine how much will go into long-term memory. I think I discussed before my inability to speak Spanish or understand Spanish well. And my inability to learn Spanish because I did not get along with my stepfather is an example of that emotional context. I was always angry because I always felt that he was trying to force me to learn something from his culture and ignore my own culture. So I couldn't really comprehend the language because I really didn't want to. I got hold to the pragmatics, but I really never truly learned Spanish fully. So when we look at mood congruent processing, we can see that the more better your emotional state is at the point of learning, the better the outcome will be. All right, so now let's look at that third law of learning, and that would be in terms of mass and distributed practice. Just like with the serial position curve, time is an element within this principle. However, rather than it being done in a singular section like the serial position curve, here it's being accomplished within multiple sessions. Now, mass practice reflects taking all the information, for example, of this lecture, of everything rather that we started within the semester that's been gathered, and attempting to bunch it all into one time slot. As you know what I'm talking about, like cramming for an exam. Oftentimes we see students attempt to cram during midterms and final exams, and we know that doesn't always work out for the best. The more we use distributed practice, the stronger the learning opportunity will be. In the orientation module, for example, you might recall that it suggested that you give yourself at least a commitment to 9 to 12 hours a week for the course. This would be an example of the distributed practice in which you'll probably be able to retain more of the information instead of trying to complete all the tasks that I asked for you in one night. We'll also have to realize that time spans is going to be different for each person. Some may need to spread the content over 15 hours or more. There are limitations based on our individual learning patterns and our abilities. All right, so it's time to just look at different learning strategies. Yeah, I'm pulling up the sleeves, folks. But we're going to take a look at this, and we've gone through this, but this is me recapping everything on what will be helpful to you. So, of course, we want to be able to focus on our working memory, being able to understand and realize that what's being put in, it takes in a lot, but it's going to filter and narrow down in its progression. And we want to be able to make sure we get the best of it. And we do that by chunking that information. We're going to try to identify the most important or relevant material so that it reaches long-term memory. Some skills we want to be able to utilize that automaticity, things that we know that we can do it without thinking about it. And you definitely want to be able to divide study time into several sessions rather than trying to mass practice. Capitalize on that primacy and recency effects. Know that you are going to be more clear-headed at the beginning. It's going to get muddled toward the middle, and you'll get that rejuvenation toward the end. You want to be able to capitalize on it and allow it to help you to lift up that middle point and not let interference become involved. Encode in multiple modes. Understand that it's like that layer of an onion that we always hear that analogy of. You want to peel at it and work at it so that the more you do this, the more that information is going into long-term memory. And definitely link it to prior knowledge. When we talked about the emotional states, we also could think about our past experiences and how we can use those associations. Learn to be able to give yourself those cues to help retrieve information more easier. Remember, for me, my cues was music, and it was putting it to my favorite song so that I was able to retrieve information easier. Question yourself about what you know and put things into your own words, your own language. We have our own language, what we understand, even though we are taking things that we've learned through our experiences and through education. We still have a way that we see and look at things. I remember one instructor said my thinking processes can be awkward, but that's all right because it's my thinking process. So in conclusion, when we're talking about the cognitive architecture, we know that there's 3 types of memory that we are working with, and that's that short-term, that's that working, and that's that long-term memory. Cognitive processes can be understood as patterns of system information that's going to flow through our cognitive system. We've looked at the principles of chunking and automaticity, as well as we've discussed the laws of learning and how it helps in terms of teaching, as well as what you remember and recall.